The hall was draped in crimson and gold, banners of House Lannister hanging beside the red sun and spear of House Martell. The air in the great hall of the Red Keep was thick with the scent of spiced wine, roasted meats, and the tension of uneasy alliances. Cersei Lannister, radiant in a gown of deep Lannister red, sat beside her husband, Oberyn Martell. Her golden curls cascaded over her shoulders, her emerald eyes scanning the gathered lords with practiced disdain. Beside her, Oberyn lounged in his chair with his characteristic smirk, his dark eyes glinting with amusement as he watched the court dance around their new reality. Theirs was a marriage born not of love, but of politics. Tywin Lannister, ever the strategist, had arranged the union years ago, securing an alliance with Dorne to quell the tensions that had simmered since the brutal murder of Elia Martell and her children. Oberyn had not been pleased, but he was not a man who shied away from duty, especially not when duty gave him proximity to his enemies. Cersei had despised the match at first. She had dreamed of a different fate, one where she would have been Rhaegar Targaryen's queen. But with Robert Baratheon married to Lyanna Stark and the war lost, her father had decided her future for her. Now, as Queen of Westeros beside King Robert, she was bound to a man who was her opposite in every way. Oberyn was wild, passionate, and unashamed of his indulgences. He was a Dornishman through and through, unconcerned with the rigid customs of the court, unapologetic in his lusts, and dangerously unpredictable. Tonight they celebrated their union publicly, though behind closed doors their marriage was anything but harmonious. The feast was in full swing when the doors to the hall opened, and Jaime Lannister entered, his golden hair catching the candlelight. Cersei felt a pang in her chest. Her twin, her true love, her other half. But Oberyn's hand on hers brought her back to the present. He was watching her, always watching, with a knowing smirk. "Your brother seems displeased," Oberyn murmured, his voice like silk laced with mockery. "Could it be that he does not approve of my affections for you, sweet wife?" Cersei pulled her hand away, her expression hardening. "My brother does not concern himself with my affairs." Oberyn chuckled, sipping his wine. "No, that's not what I hear." Cersei's nails dug into her palm. She had expected Oberyn's provocations. He was not a man to keep his tongue in check, but she would not let him bait her. Not here, not now. Tywin Lannister, seated at the head of the table, raised his goblet. "To House Lannister and House Martell," he declared, his deep voice commanding the attention of the room. "May this union bring peace to Westeros." The lords and ladies echoed the toast, but Cersei knew better. Peace was a fragile illusion, especially in a court filled with whispers and daggers. As the night wore on, Oberyn's presence beside her became more suffocating. He drank freely, laughed loudly, and let his gaze linger on men and women alike. Cersei knew he was testing her patience, pushing her limits. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction, not yet. But when he leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, and murmured, "Shall we give them a true show of our love, my dear queen?" She could take no more. She stood abruptly, her goblet clattering against the table. The hall fell silent. Tywin's sharp gaze cut to her, but she ignored him. Without a word, she turned and left the hall, her heart pounding. Oberyn followed. Cersei stormed through the dimly lit corridors of the Red Keep, her fury barely contained. She could hear Oberyn's footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. "Running from your husband already?" His voice was filled with amusement, laced with that infuriating Dornish drawl. "Come now, sweet wife, is this how you honor our sacred vows?" Cersei whirled around, her emerald eyes blazing. "You mock me before the entire court. You humiliate me with your depravity." Oberyn only smirked, stepping closer. "Oh?" And what exactly have I done, dear wife? Drunk too much wine? Laughed too loudly? Or is it because I did not pretend to be the dutiful, obedient husband you so desperately wish for? Cersei clenched her fists. You flaunt your lovers in my face, men and women alike. Do you take pleasure in making a fool of me? Oberyn chuckled, his dark eyes alight with mischief. Ah, but you misunderstand me, Cersei. I do not seek to make a fool of you. I seek to make you see. See what? She spat. He leaned in, close enough that she could smell the Dornish wine on his breath, the scent of the warm southern sands still lingering on his skin. That I am not your enemy, that this game you play, clutching at power, trying to control everything, will consume you in the end. Cersei scoffed. You know nothing of power. Oberyn tilted his head. Do I not? My brother rules Dorne, but tell me, who truly holds sway over its people? Is it the ruler on the throne, or the one who moves in the shadows, shaping fate with whispers and steel? Cersei narrowed her eyes. And you claim to be the latter? He smiled, but it was a dangerous thing. I claim to be a man who knows the difference between control and true influence. You, my dear queen, are so desperate to hold the reins that you forget. Power is not taken. It is given. She hated how easily he unnerved her, how his words, though spoken in jest, cut too close to the truth. You are a fool, she said, turning away. Oberyn caught her wrist, not harshly, not in anger, but firmly. You may hate me, Cersei. That is your right, but do not mistake my nature for weakness. She pulled free. I mistake nothing, least of all you. And with that, she left him standing in the corridor, his laughter echoing behind her. Cersei found herself in her chambers, pacing. She needed to regain control of her emotions, of her marriage, of everything. She could not allow Oberyn to unsettle her. He was reckless, yes, but he was also dangerous. And if she was not careful, he could become more than just an annoyance. He could become an obstacle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. Come, she called. The door opened, and Jaime stepped inside, golden armor gleaming in the candlelight. For a moment, the sight of him calmed her. He was her rock, her constant, the only one who had ever truly belonged to her. Cersei, he said, closing the door behind him. What happened at the feast? She let out a breath, crossing the room to pour herself wine. Oberyn happened, Jaime frowned. Has he hurt you? Cersei hesitated. Not in the way you mean. She turned, studying her brother. Tell me, Jaime, how long do you think I can endure this? Jaime's jaw tightened. If he mistreats you, I will. You will do nothing, she interrupted sharply. You cannot. I am a queen now, Jaime. My battles must be fought with words, not swords. Jaime looked as though he wanted to argue, but he remained silent. Cersei stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. Stay with me tonight. Jaime hesitated. Cersei, if we... I need you, she whispered, pressing against him. I cannot bear this alone. His resolve wavered. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. You are never alone. For a moment she allowed herself to believe that. Meanwhile, Oberyn Martell did not return to his chambers. Instead, he walked the moonlit gardens of the Red Keep, his mind restless. He had agreed to this marriage for Dorne's sake, but he had no love for the Lannisters. Every time he looked at Cersei, he saw Tywin's cruelty, the legacy of his sister's murder. And yet, she intrigued him. She was not weak, not like Robert. She was fire and steel, and though she despised him, he wondered, could she be turned? Could she be made to see that her father's way, her family's way, was not the only path to power? A voice interrupted his thoughts. You toy with fire, Prince Oberyn. He turned to find Varys watching him, his hands clasped in that ever-calculating way. Oberyn smirked. Fire keeps life warm, does it not? Varys studied him. Or burns those who believe they can control it. Oberyn chuckled. Tell me, Spider, what do you see in our dear queen? Varys's expression did not change. I see a woman who believes herself untouchable, and a man who may prove otherwise. Oberyn smiled. Then let us see who burns first. The dawn rose over King's Landing, casting a warm glow over the Red Keep, but inside its cold stone walls, warmth was a fleeting illusion. Cersei sat by her window, watching the city awaken. Merchants set up their stalls, beggars crowded the alleys, and the people moved like ants. Insignificant beneath her notice, Jaime was gone. He had slipped out before the first light, ever cautious, ever aware of the danger their closeness invited. Cersei hated the secrecy, but what choice did they have? Their love was forbidden, their bond unbreakable yet constantly threatened. Her thoughts, however, were interrupted by the knock at her chamber doors. She already knew who it was before she even called out, "Enter!" Oberyn Martell strolled in like he owned the place, dressed in loose Dornish silks, his expression unreadable, yet entirely too smug for her liking. His dark eyes flickered over her, taking in her unbound golden hair, the sheer dressing gown draped over her form. He did not avert his gaze like a proper husband might. No, he drank in the sight, unashamed. You look lovely in the morning light, dear wife, he said casually, pouring himself a cup of wine from the table as if he belonged here. Cersei bristled. And you look as though you've just come from someone else's bed. He grinned. Ah, but you wound me. What kind of husband would I be if I neglected my own wife for the pleasures of another? Cersei clenched her jaw. She would not let him bait her. Not again. What do you want, Oberyn? Oberyn sipped his wine, his gaze sharp as he studied her. I want to know how long you intend to keep up this charade. She arched an eyebrow. Charade? Yes, he said smoothly, stepping closer. You pretend to be the loyal wife, yet your heart belongs elsewhere. You sit beside me at feasts, yet you dream of another's touch. It is almost tragic, if it were not so amusing. Cersei's fingers twitched, aching to strike him. You think you know me? Oberyn smirked. I know the look of a woman who craves control but has none. She took a step forward, narrowing the space between them. And what of you, husband? You play the role of the dutiful consort, yet your heart still burns with vengeance. You smile at my father, drink his wine, share his table, but I see the hatred in your eyes. You would slit his throat if you thought you could. Oberyn's smile faltered, if only for a moment. Then he chuckled. Perhaps we are not so different after all. Cersei's lips curled into a smirk. No, we are nothing alike. You are reckless. You let your emotions control you. That is why my father will always be a step ahead of you. Oberyn studied her, his amusement fading. And you? Do you believe you are a step ahead of your father? Cersei hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough. Oberyn laughed softly, setting down his cup. You play a dangerous game, my queen, but be careful. There are pieces on this board that do not move as you expect. He turned, making his way toward the door. Just before he left, he glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. One day, Cersei, he murmured, you will realize that I am not your enemy. But by then, it may be too late. Then he was gone. Cersei exhaled, her hands trembling with anger. She despised him. She despised his games, his arrogance, his ability to see through her so effortlessly. But more than that, she despised the nagging thought that he might be right. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, casting a crimson glow over King's Landing, Cersei made her way through the Red Keep with purpose. The halls were quieter now, servants keeping to themselves and guards barely sparing her a glance. She stopped before a heavy wooden door and knocked once. "Enter," came the voice from within. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, finding herself face to face with her father. Tywin Lannister sat at his desk, quill in hand, ever the picture of control and power. He did not look up immediately, finishing whatever he was writing before setting the quill aside. "Cersei," he said finally, "what brings you here?" She stepped forward. "We need to talk about my husband." Tywin exhaled through his nose, as if the very subject was an inconvenience. "Oberyn Martell is your husband by my design. You will honor that arrangement." Cersei clenched her fists. "You think this marriage benefits us, but you do not understand him. He will never be controlled. He watches. He waits. He hates you, father. And one day, he will strike." Tywin finally looked at her, his gaze cold. "And yet he has not, because he knows that to move against me would be to move against the throne. Whatever desires he harbors for revenge, he is not foolish enough to act on them while his family remains vulnerable in Dorne." Cersei shook her head. "You underestimate him." Tywin leaned back in his chair. "No, Cersei, you overestimate yourself." The words cut deeper than she cared to admit. Her father continued, "You let your emotions cloud your judgment. You see Oberyn as a problem because he does not kneel to you as Robert did. But that is precisely why this marriage was necessary. You are a Lannister, and Lannisters do not act on impulse. You will endure. You will control him, not through force, but through patience." Cersei seethed, but she knew better than to argue. Tywin's gaze hardened. "You are my daughter. I expect you to behave as such." She bowed her head slightly, a false sign of obedience. "Yes, father." Without another word, she turned and left. Oberyn stood on the balcony of his chambers, looking out at the city below. The cool night breeze carried the scent of salt and fire, the ever-present aroma of King's Landing. He heard the door open behind him, but he did not turn. "I was beginning to think you would never come." Illyria Sand stepped beside him, her dark eyes watching him closely. "You play a dangerous game, my love." Oberyn smirked. "I always have." Illyria studied him. "She will never trust you, Oberyn. And Tywin Lannister is not a man to be trifled with." He exhaled, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "I did not come here to play the obedient husband. I came here for justice." Illyria touched his arm. "And if justice is beyond your reach?" Oberyn's expression darkened. "Then I will burn their kingdom to the ground." The night was quiet, but within the Red Keep, silence was always deceptive. Cersei lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, sleep eluding her. The words of both Oberyn and her father echoed in her mind, clashing like swords in a battle she could not escape. She hated Oberyn, hated how easily he read her, how he dared to challenge her at every turn. But she also knew he was no fool. He would never bend to her will, nor would he be an obedient husband. He was dangerous, and dangerous men had to be controlled or eliminated. Her thoughts were interrupted by the creak of her door. She knew who it was before she even turned her head. "Jaime." He shut the door behind him, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight. "You should not call for me so often," he murmured, but there was no true protest in his voice. He would never deny her. Cersei sat up, the silk of her gown pooling around her. "I did not call for you." Jaime hesitated, then stepped closer. "You are troubled," she scoffed. "When am I not?" Jaime sat beside her on the bed, his fingers brushing against hers. "Is it him?" She clenched her jaw. "He is insufferable." Jaime smirked slightly. "I could put a sword through him." She wished it were that simple. But Oberyn was not a common threat. Killing him would mean war with Dorne, something even Tywin would not risk. No, He had to be handled carefully. Cersei met Jaime's gaze. You cannot help me with this. Not this time. Jaime frowned. Cersei, I can handle my husband. She cut him off sharply. I will not be made a fool of. Not by him. Not by anyone. Jaime studied her, then sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I worry for you. She grasped his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. Do not. I am a Lannister, and I will win. The next morning, Cersei was composed once more. She moved through the castle with her usual poise, her expression unreadable as she attended to her duties as queen. But she was always aware of Oberyn, always watching him as he moved through court with infuriating ease. He was dangerous, yes, but he had one weakness, his passion, and she would use it against him. She found him in the gardens, reclining on a stone bench, speaking in hushed tones with Ilaria Sand. They looked at ease, their hands brushing occasionally, their connection evident in every movement. Cersei approached without hesitation, her presence casting a shadow over their moment. Ilaria was the first to look up, her dark eyes unreadable. She studied Cersei for a long moment before rising to her feet. I will leave you to your wife, she murmured, pressing a kiss to Oberyn's forehead before departing. Oberyn smirked, lounging against the bench. To what do I owe the pleasure, dear wife? Cersei sat beside him, ignoring the casual way he sprawled, as if he owned the world. We need to speak. He raised an eyebrow. A first. Usually you prefer to hiss your displeasure from across the room. She ignored the jab. This marriage, this alliance, it will not work if you continue to make a spectacle of yourself. Oberyn chuckled. Oh, my love, I was making a spectacle of myself long before I married into your family. Cersei leaned closer, lowering her voice. Do not mistake me for a fool, Oberyn. You do not care for this marriage. You do not care for my father's games, but you care for Dorne. And if you wish to see it protected, then you will behave accordingly. Oberyn's smirk faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. Is that a threat? Cersei smiled, slow and deliberate. It is a reminder. For a moment, Oberyn said nothing. Then he tilted his head, studying her with something almost like admiration. You are more dangerous than I thought. She met his gaze without flinching. And you are not as untouchable as you believe. Oberyn chuckled, shaking his head. Ah, Cersei, you would have made a fine Dornish woman. Cersei rose to her feet, smoothing her gown. Then perhaps you should start treating me like one. She turned and walked away, leaving Oberyn watching her, his smirk returning. She had drawn her first line in the sand. Now it was only a matter of time before he crossed it. Cersei sat in her solar, fingers tracing the rim of her goblet, her thoughts a storm beneath the surface. She had always known how to play this game, how to control weak men, bend them to her will, make them dance to whatever tune she played. But Oberyn Martell was no weak man. He was dangerous, not because he was reckless, not because he was unfaithful, but because he did not fear her. He did not even fear her father, and that made him unpredictable. She needed a new approach. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Enter, she called, her voice even. The door opened, and Pycelle shuffled in, his white beard trembling as he bowed. Your Grace, Prince Oberyn, has requested an audience with you in the gardens. Cersei frowned. She had expected him to retaliate for their last conversation, but not this quickly. Very well, she said, standing smoothly. I will not keep my husband waiting. She moved through the castle with deliberate grace, ignoring the murmuring courtiers who pretended not to watch her. By the time she reached the gardens, the sun was beginning to set, bathing the sky in a crimson hue. Oberyn was waiting for her beneath an orange tree, his stance relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wore Dornish silks, golden embroidery catching the dying light. He looked every bit the Prince of Dorne, wild, untamed, confident. "You came," he said with a small smile. Cersei arched an eyebrow. "You summoned me, husband." Oberyn chuckled. "Ah, but only because you intrigue me, my dear wife." Cersei exhaled sharply. "If this is another one of your games, I have little patience for it." Oberyn's smile did not fade. "It is always a game, Cersei. The question is, do you know the rules?" She crossed her arms, unimpressed. "You think yourself clever." He tilted his head. "I know myself to be clever." Cersei's eyes narrowed. "What is it you want, Oberyn?" He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "The truth." She stiffened. "The truth?" Oberyn smirked, watching her reaction. "Tell me, sweet wife, do you ever tire of wearing a mask? Of pretending to be something you are not?" Cersei clenched her jaw. "I do not pretend." Oberyn chuckled. "No? Then tell me, why do you cling so desperately to control? Why do you hold your father's leash so tightly, yet refuse to admit that he holds yours even tighter?" Cersei inhaled sharply, but Oberyn was not finished. "Why do you fight so hard for power," he murmured, stepping closer, "when you will never truly have it?" Her hand struck him before she even realized she had moved. The sound echoed through the garden, sharp and final. Oberyn's head turned slightly from the impact, but when he looked back at her, there was no anger in his gaze, only amusement. "You see," he whispered, "I have struck a nerve." Cersei's chest heaved, her heart pounding. She wanted to strike him again, to wipe that smirk from his face, to make him bleed for his insolence. Instead, she turned sharply and stormed away, leaving him standing beneath the orange tree, laughing softly to himself. Cersei did not return to her chambers that night. Instead, she went to the one place where she felt truly safe. Jaime's room. She entered without knocking, closing the door behind her. Jaime was already awake, sitting by the window, his sword laid across his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Cersei," he murmured. She did not speak. Instead, she crossed the room, taking his face in her hands, pressing her lips to his with desperate urgency. Jaime responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. But when they finally broke apart, he searched her face, his brow furrowing. "What happened?" She shook her head. "I do not want to talk about it." Jaime exhaled, brushing a strand of golden hair from her face. "You only come to me like this when you are angry." Cersei looked away. "He thinks he understands me. He thinks he can see me." Jaime's jaw tightened. "Oberyn?" Cersei nodded, her hands balling into fists. "He does not fear me. He does not even fear father." Jaime's grip on her tightened slightly. "Then he is a fool." Cersei let out a bitter laugh. That is the problem. He is not a fool." Jaime was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice low. "Do you want me to do something about him?" Cersei considered it. She could have Oberyn removed, quietly, efficiently. But no, his death would be too obvious, too dangerous. Dorne would retaliate. She needed something more. Subtle. She met Jaime's gaze. "Not yet, but if the time comes." Jaime nodded, understanding unspoken between them. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. He was the only thing in this world she could trust, and she would not let Oberyn take that away from her. Meanwhile, Oberyn sat in his chambers, sipping wine, his thoughts lingering on his wife. Cersei Lannister was fascinating, a woman of fire and ice, of contradictions and unspoken desires. She hated him, but he had seen something in her eyes tonight, something raw. He smiled to himself. This marriage was supposed to be a political arrangement, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could become something more. something far more dangerous. Cersei stood before the mirror in her chambers, running a golden brush through her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. The act was methodical, a way to steady herself, to maintain control. She had spent her life mastering control of her father's expectations, of the court's whispers, of her own desires. But Oberyn had disrupted that. He had reached inside her carefully constructed world and unsettled the foundation beneath her feet. And she despised him for it. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "My queen," a voice called from the other side. A servant, no doubt, awaiting her command. "Enter," she said, placing the brush down. The door creaked open, and a young serving girl stepped in, bowing quickly before speaking. "Prince Oberyn has requested your presence in the courtyard." Cersei's fingers twitched, but her face remained impassive. Again. First the gardens, now the courtyard. Oberyn was making a habit of summoning her as if she were the one meant to answer his call. How quickly he seemed to forget that this was her kingdom. Still, she would go. Not because he commanded it, but because she needed to see what game he was playing. The courtyard was alive with energy when she arrived. Dornishmen sparred with Lannister guards, their movements fluid, their strikes precise. A crowd had gathered to watch, courtiers and common folk alike murmuring among themselves. Cersei's gaze swept across the yard until she found him. Oberyn stood at the center of the chaos, his spear glinting in the midday sun as he moved effortlessly between two opponents. He was laughing as he fought, dodging blows with ease, his body twisting like a serpent. For a moment she simply watched. She had seen many men fight, her father's knights, her brother Jaime, even the Mountain himself. They fought with brute force, with discipline, with duty. But Oberyn fought with passion, and he was winning. With a final swift movement, he disarmed both men, sending their swords clattering to the ground. The crowd erupted in cheers as Oberyn stepped back, twirling his spear before planting it firmly into the dirt. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met across the courtyard. Oberyn smirked. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted his hand and beckoned her forward. The arrogance, the audacity. Cersei clenched her jaw but did not hesitate. She strode toward him, her presence commanding. The crowd parted as she approached, all eyes now on her. Oberyn bowed theatrically as she stopped before him. "My queen," he murmured, amusement lacing his tone. Cersei ignored the formalities. "You summoned me, husband." Oberyn straightened, still smirking. "I wished for you to see something." He gestured toward the fallen swords. "Strength is not measured in steel alone, my love. A lesson your family has yet to learn." Cersei's eyes narrowed. "And what lesson would you teach me, Oberyn?" Oberyn stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "That brute force does not always win. That power is not always held by those who shout the loudest." Cersei refused to step back, even as he invaded her space. "You believe yourself powerful?" Oberyn tilted his head. "I know I am. But you?" His eyes searched hers. "You are still trying to convince yourself." Cersei's breath hitched, but her face remained cold. "You speak as though you understand me." Oberyn smiled. "I do. And that, dear wife, is what frightens you." Cersei exhaled sharply. "You are a fool if you think I fear you." Oberyn chuckled, brushing past her as he retrieved his spear. "Perhaps, but tell me, Cersei, why are your hands trembling?" She looked down instinctively, only to realize they were steady. She snapped her gaze back to his, furious at the deception. "You play dangerous games, Martell." Oberyn grinned. "As do you, Lannister. The difference is, I enjoy them." Cersei turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the way the crowd still whispered, ignoring the way her heart still pounded. Oberyn was testing her, but he would soon learn. Cersei Lannister did not lose. That night Cersei found herself once again pacing in her chambers, her mind restless. She hated how easily Oberyn got under her skin, hated that he looked at her as if he could see her, truly see her in a way no man ever had, except for one. A soft knock came at the door, and she already knew who it was before she even answered. Jaime stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He studied her, his brow furrowed. "You've been on edge," Cersei exhaled, turning away. "He is insufferable." Jaime took a step closer. "Do you want me to kill him?" Cersei paused. Did she? She wanted Oberyn gone, yes. Wanted to rid herself of his smug glances, his knowing smiles, his infuriating words. But killing him was too easy. Number. She wanted to break him. She turned back to Jaime, her expression unreadable. "Not yet, but I need your help with something else." Jaime arched an eyebrow. "What?" Cersei smiled. "If Oberyn wishes to play games," she murmured, "then let us give him one he will never forget." Meanwhile, Oberyn sat on the balcony of his chambers, watching the moonlit city. Ellaria was beside him, tracing circles against his skin. "You are playing with fire, my love," Oberyn smirked. "Then let us see who burns first." The torches flickered along the stone corridors of the Red Keep, their glow casting long shadows as Cersei moved through the halls with silent purpose. Her gown flowed behind her golden hair unbound, and yet despite her regal presence, she felt like a predator in the dark, waiting to strike. Jaime walked beside her, his golden hand glinting under the torchlight. He was the only one she trusted, the only one who had ever truly been hers. And tonight, he would help her set the first stone in Oberyn's downfall. "You haven't told me what this plan of yours is," Jaime murmured, his voice low. Cersei smirked, her fingers trailing along the cold stone walls. "Oberyn is reckless, but he is not stupid. If we want to defeat him, we must make him believe he is winning." Jaime frowned. "You want to let him think he has the upper hand?" She stopped, turning to face her brother. "Yes. And then, when he is at his most confident, we will strike." Jaime studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "What do you need me to do?" Cersei placed a hand on his chest, her nails grazing the fabric of his tunic. "I need you to keep watch. There are certain rumors I wish to start, and I cannot have anyone interfering." Jaime's brow furrowed. "Rumors?" Cersei smiled. "Oberyn is a man of passion. Let us see how he reacts when his pride is wounded." Jaime exhaled, shaking his head. "You are dangerous, sister." Cersei's smile widened. "I am a Lannister." The next morning, the whispers had already begun. It started in the servants' quarters, then moved swiftly through the halls of the Red Keep. By midday, even the nobles were murmuring about it. "The queen has taken a new lover," one whispered. "A Dornish knight, no less," said another. "They say he visits her chambers at night," an old noblewoman muttered. "Prince Oberyn will not stand for this." By the time the rumors reached Oberyn himself, he was seated at a feast in the Great Hall, drinking Dornish wine as he listened to the chatter around him. His expression did not change, but his grip on his goblet tightened. Ellaria leaned in beside him, her lips brushing his ear. "They are trying to provoke you, my love." Oberyn smirked, but it did not reach his eyes. "Oh, I know." Ellaria studied him. "And what will you do?" Oberyn took another slow sip of wine. "Wait, watch, and when the time is right." His eyes flickered across the room, landing on Cersei where she sat beside Robert, pretending not to notice him. "I will remind them that I am not a man to be played with." Cersei sat poised, her expression unreadable as she listened to the courtly discussions around her. She did not need to look at Oberyn to know he had heard the rumors. She could feel his gaze on her. Good. She had planted the seed of doubt, and now all she had to do was let it grow. Robert, oblivious as ever, was already deep in his cups, laughing at some crude joke with his men. He would never notice the war she was waging right beside him. Her father, however, was watching. Tywin's sharp eyes flickered between her and Oberyn, calculating as always. He did not approve of her games, but he also would not interfere unless it became a problem. Cersei took a delicate sip of her wine, allowing herself a small, satisfied smile. Oberyn thought he could unsettle her. He had no idea who he was dealing with. That night, as the castle slept, Oberyn did not return to his chambers. Instead, he made his way through the halls of the Red Keep with slow, deliberate steps. He did not knock when he reached her door. He simply opened it and stepped inside. Cersei was waiting. She was seated by the fireplace, her gown draped over her legs, her golden hair cascading down her back. She did not look surprised to see him. Oberyn closed the door behind him. "You are playing a dangerous game, wife." Cersei smirked, swirling the wine in her goblet. "And you are not?" Oberyn stepped closer, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Do you think I am a fool?" Cersei took a slow sip of wine, then set the goblet down. "I think you are many things, Oberyn, but a fool is not one of them." He stopped in front of her, tilting his head. "Then tell me, why?" Cersei arched an eyebrow. "Why what?" Oberyn's voice dropped lower. "Why provoke me? Why spread whispers meant to wound my pride?" Cersei leaned back in her chair, regarding him with amusement. "Because I wanted to see what you would do." Oberyn exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. Cersei's amusement flickered into curiosity. "You find this funny?" Oberyn smirked. "I find it fascinating." Cersei narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Oberyn leaned down, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair, bringing his face close to hers. "You think you are the only one who knows how to manipulate?" Cersei held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "And what will you do about it?" Oberyn smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, my love, I will play along, but when the time comes, I will make sure you are the one left vulnerable." Cersei's heart pounded, but she did not let it show. Instead, she simply smirked. "We shall see, husband." Oberyn chuckled, straightening. "Yes, we shall." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the flickering firelight. Cersei exhaled, gripping the arms of her chair. This was not over, not by a long shot. The Red Keep had never felt so suffocating. Cersei stood on the balcony of her chambers, looking down at the city below. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and filth, the ever-present stench of King's Landing. She barely noticed it. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of him. Oberyn had not broken. She had spread whispers, provoked his temper, tested his patience, but he had endured it all with that infuriating smirk, that maddening confidence. He was waiting, watching, and that unsettled her. Cersei had spent her life learning how to control men. Robert had been easy, drunk, and foolish. Jaime had been easier, willing to do anything for her love. Even her father, for all his power, had always underestimated how far she was willing to go. But Oberyn, he was different. She heard the door open behind her, followed by the sound of boots against stone. She did not turn. "You come uninvited again, husband," she said coolly. Oberyn chuckled, stepping closer. "You wound me, my love. Should a husband not visit his wife?" Cersei exhaled slowly, gripping the stone railing. "What do you want, Oberyn?" Oberyn came to stand beside her, his gaze following hers toward the city below. "You have spent so much time trying to break me, Cersei. Have you ever stopped to wonder why you have not succeeded?" Cersei finally turned to face him. "Because you are arrogant." Oberyn smirked. "Number, because I am not afraid of you." The words hit like a dagger between her ribs. though she kept her expression blank. Oberyn leaned in slightly. That is what truly frightens you, isn't it? That you cannot control me the way you control others. That no matter what you do, I will not bow. Cersei's nails dug into her palm. You think this is a victory for you? Oberyn tilted his head, watching her. I think we are more alike than you care to admit. Cersei scoffed. We are nothing alike. Oberyn smiled, his voice lowering. Oh, but we are. You and I, we are creatures of passion. We burn brighter than the fools who surround us. The only difference is, I embrace what I am. You fight it. Cersei clenched her jaw. You know nothing of me. Oberyn studied her for a long moment, then shook his head with a soft chuckle. You truly believe that, don't you? Before she could answer, he reached out, gently, deliberately, and ran a single finger along her jawline. A whisper of a touch, a challenge. Cersei did not move, did not flinch. Oberyn's voice was a murmur, barely above a whisper. Tell me, Cersei, if you hate me so much, why do you tremble when I touch you? Fire spread through her veins. She hated him. She loathed him. And yet, before she could stop herself, she grabbed him by the collar of his tunic and crushed her lips against his. It was fire meeting fire. Oberyn responded immediately, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her against him. The heat between them was electric, searing, a battle of dominance fought not with words but with lips and teeth and desperation. Cersei was drowning in it, in the sheer wrongness of it, in the way he tasted of wine and spice and danger. She was losing control, and she hated it. With a sharp breath, she shoved him away, breathing heavily. Oberyn took a step back, his lips still curved in that damnable smirk. Well, he murmured, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. That was unexpected. Cersei wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, as if she could erase what had just happened. That was a mistake. Oberyn chuckled. Perhaps. He leaned in slightly. But you enjoyed it. Cersei's glare could have melted steel. Leave. Now. Oberyn bowed mockingly. As you command, my queen. Then without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her breathless and furious. Cersei stood there for a long moment, fists clenched at her sides. She had lost control, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted it back.